Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge that the Oakville Public Library is situated on Treaty 14 and Treaty 22 lands and is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It is also the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The current community of Oakville is home to many different First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Regardless, though, of where we come from, we are all interconnected through the land on which we live, the water that we use, and the air that we breathe. We are committed at Oakville Public Library to a continuous learning journey in allyship. We seek to elevate Indigenous voices and lived experience to cultivate reconciliation in Oakville, and I hope you will join me in seeking the same wherever you are located. But now on to our speaker. We are very fortunate to have Linda Yip present to us tonight. Not only is she a professional genealogist, but she is an accomplished entrepreneur, storyteller, and author. In addition to her genealogy work, she is a member of the Ancestry Canada Advisory Board and blogs at her very popular site, past-presents.com. Linda has a very special offer for attendees this evening who might want to purchase her book, Getting Started in Chinese Genealogy, but I'll let her fill you in on those details after her presentation. And without any further ado, over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you to the Oakville Public Library, to my friends and mentors in the genealogy community, and really everyone who's ever asked me to speak. It is my honor and privilege to be talking to you today. So I'm a genealogist. I've been doing my genealogy for decades, pushing 3 decades at this point. And what's interesting about my genealogy is that as I've been pushing out my patrilineal line, that's my dad's line, I don't really just follow his line. I follow wherever my curiosity takes me, and I've got over 2,000 people. Every pink dot in this picture is a person. And what I appear to be mapping out is kind of the history of the Chinese in Canada. So this talk is really about a mystery, and it's about this document. And so I'm going to tell you this story. My dad didn't have much story for us as kids. And because he was so strong, silent type, I was an intensely curious person. I still am. And so unbeknownst to him, when I was quite young, 10, 11, 12, I was snooping in his things, just dreadfully curious, and I found this document. And it completely confused me. So on this document, it says, Department of Immigration and Colonization, Chinese Immigration Service. This is to certify that Yip Wing Si, blah, 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 registered under the Chinese Immigration Act in Vancouver, the 11th of June, 1924. And there's this picture, a cute 2-year-old. Okay, well, all kinds of questions. My dad was born in Vancouver, so why does he have a certificate that says Department of Immigration and Colonization, Chinese immigration? Like, what? So I asked him. I went downstairs and I said, hey, Dad, I found the certificate, and you know what he said? He said, don't go through my things. So it's taken me almost 30 years to understand this document, and I will tell you today. We talked about my blog. I will skip this slide. We talked about the things that I've done. I'll skip this slide too. So my book is basically a collection of my best blogs, except with a cohesive line where I discuss tools and techniques. And the reason why I just want to mention, the reason why I had to write this blog and this book, I felt, was that I approach it from the perspective of someone who doesn't speak or read Chinese. Therefore, I have nothing but learning to accomplish, and I ask all the most basic questions and bring that to you. So most of these concepts were completely baffling to me all the way growing up, and recently, as in just a couple of weeks ago, it was added to the Library of Congress. Wow. So what makes genealogy impossible? Some factors could include there are no birth, marriage, or death records or baptismal records. In genealogy, we call those BMDs for short. There might be few original records. There are few authored works, meaning that not that many historians have, for example, looked at the history of the tie in Canadian history. It's not in English or a European language, meaning it doesn't use the alphabet. And it could be that it was not considered historically significant until like 1970s. So that speaks of record loss. Because, if I couldn't read it, then it can't be that important. So, okay, which genealogies fall in this category? I did a mind map of which ones, and I looked at Family Search to see, this is just a brief picture to give you an idea that there are many, many genealogies where our work as genealogists are pushing the boundaries. I personally work in Chinese, but there are so many others. The world is crying out for more expert genealogists in Indigenous, in Japanese, in Black history, and just the list goes on. So, impossible. I mentioned I have been doing genealogy a while, but here's this story. So, Liping Wong Yip shared a copy of her book with me. It turns out that she is married to a distant cousin, and when she was looking for her great-grandfather in 2014, the curator said this, as she writes, "The curator told me that Wali was a firm name for a group of people. In the curator's opinion, I was embarking on an impossible mission to find the real name of our great-grandfather." Impossible. So, spoiler alert, as you can probably tell from the title, she found her great-grandfather's real name and his entire story, because the title says, From Wali to Chu Qin. If you haven't read this book and you're interested in Chinese genealogy, Liping did an amazing job of researching her great-grandfather's history in Barkerville. I highly recommend it. Not because she's married to my cousin. Okay, so when we're looking at records, we're looking at for information, and I've broken this down into 3 broad categories. Church, where we might see birth, baptismal, marriage, and death registers. Church publications, such as newsletters. Church governance, which is who governed in the church, who held positions, those lists. From government, we will find census records, immigration, tax, vital statistics, and probate. Now, when I speak of government, I have a really wide net here. I'm talking about federal, provincial, municipal, quasi-governmental organizations, the public school board. It's like a big net. And from family and business, I include DNA, because nothing could be more personal than your own genetic material, family Bibles, interviews, letters, photos, wills including holographic wills, because holographic wills, or wills that you write yourself, are legal in Canada. In other words, you can use them. And so I have recently completed my level 1 project for the International Commission for the Accreditation of Professional Genealogists, or ICAPGen. And when I was studying at the international accreditation level, I noticed that, broadly speaking, certain record classes are considered generally available. They are here. I won't go through the first category because I just said that, but church records, voters lists, tax and probate records, immigration records, land records such as homestead files, wills, which could be filed with the courts, and DNA, generally available. Okay, so let's jump into DNA, because usually people ask, well, what if I just spit in a tube, like expecting a great result? And I call this spit and hope. Okay, so what about DNA for Chinese ancestry? When we are spitting into a tube for Chinese ancestry, we're not generally looking for ethnicity. Ethnicity is usually pretty obvious. The goal is to find first and second cousinships so that you can triangulate your results to find missing persons in your family tree. I have copied and pasted from Ancestry DNA their current reference samples, 69,000 people, 84 world regions, 6,500 reference samples worldwide. Now that sounds really good, except here's the thing, and sorry for my Irish friends, I'm picking on Central Ireland. Central Ireland, the country of Ireland, is 84,000 square kilometers, and Ancestry DNA has 40 regions for this country. I joke that you can practically see your great-grandfather's shop. It's not quite that granular, but it's pretty granular. By contrast, China is the third largest country in the world after Canada, has 9.6 million square kilometers, and it has 6 regions. 6. All of northern China is one region. I mean, this is like several countries all wrapped into one place. It's slowly breaking out eastern China and Southeast Asia into Guangdong, Guangzhou, and the rest. But I have to tell you, as a Chinese Canadian researcher, first of all, I am studying the period 1850 to 1950, partly due to Canadian privacy laws, and partly because for this period, 4/5 of all Chinese settlers to Canada came from Guangdong province. And so you see, if I get a DNA test that says, hey, you're Chinese and you come from Guangdong, I'd be like, oh yeah, well, that was a surprise. Okay, so what are the tools? When we are looking at impossible genealogy, let's categorize the tools that are available to us. Experts, your knowledge of history, your record availability, and tech tools. Just for tech tools, because I'm only going to concentrate on one thing in this talk. Tech tools that I'm thinking about are DNA tools, because you need computers to use them, our laptops, software, our family tree building software, my Excel spreadsheets, all that stuff. Language tools. But let's start first with people. People. Experts and mentors. Here I would like to honor 2 professors that have influenced my work and taught me so much. Dr. Celia Tan in Wu Yi, Dr. Henry Yu, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia, and I just met Dr. Zhang in 2019 at Wu Yi. In addition, what I'm saying for impossible genealogy is don't shorten your list to only genealogists. Broaden your net. They don't have to be genealogists. People that have informed me in my journey have been across the board: writers, archivists, curators, professors, anyone who has taught me a tip or a technique or highlighted something interesting that helps me understand my people. Here they all are, a short list of experts and mentors. Okay, so that was experts. Now let's talk about your knowledge of history. What do we mean by that? Here I have 15 different categories. We are not going to be able to talk about all 15 today, but I would like to bring your attention to legal and regulatory, because that's what we'll be concentrating on. A little bit of religious and political. We're going to be talking a little bit about criminal. But you see, I'm really only hitting 3 of these categories because there's so much to learn. So history, your knowledge of history. Let me pull 3 things out of the previous 15 categories: timelines, record sets, and church records. Timelines. So I built this timeline to look at the presence of Chinese persons in Canada, and Dr. Henry Yu and his team at UBC have been doing incredibly work showing that the first Chinese people in Canada came in 1788 at Nootka Sound. 1788. This is where genealogy and history kind of meets archaeology. Because the thing is, it's generally thought that Chinese persons historically came to Canada about the time of the railway. They came to build the railway, and they have been in Canada since then. But what that idea misses is the 50 years, 1848 to 1898, of the gold rush, where Chinese definitely came to Canada for the gold rush and can be found. I'm working on cases where the families predate by a long margin the building of the railway. And in this timeline, I've also highlighted a number of other important dates in Chinese Canadian history. But what I'm saying to you as a researcher is know what important dates affect your population, because those are going to be keys to your finding your genealogies. In this case, I've got disenfranchisement, that's the loss of the vote. The Immigration Act was brought in 1885, the Exclusion Act was brought in 1923, the Exclusion Act was repealed in 1947, but it kind of hung around for another 20 years until 1967, and voting was reinstated in 1948, which means for most people there won't be voters lists until 1949. Okay, so let's talk about record sets now. When I have done cases for Northern European genealogy, I can do the majority of my work in only 2 major databases: Ancestry, for its amazing passenger records lists, and Family Search. That's only 2. And in European settler record sets, I have like 12 categories where European settlers are likely to be included. Census records, they were likely to be enumerated with their names. Church records, denominated by faith. College yearbooks, because they may have gone to college. DNA pools of genetic matches. For those new to DNA, let me tell you that if you spit in a tube and you are American and you are Caucasian, holy cow, thousands of results. City directories, they were more likely to be included in the alphabetical section as well as the street section and the business section. That is not the case for Chinese. Family trees, they may have already been built out. There are historical genealogy societies that in Canada, such as the Fathers of Confederation. Homestead records for white settlers. Land records for persons able to buy land. Military records for persons able to fight and be called up. Newspapers are more likely to report a person by name as opposed to race. The Chinese person who lived here, the Japanese person who lived there, the Asians, the Indians. Sorry, but that is the language that was used. Voters lists, as I mentioned before. So comparing that against Chinese settler record sets, there are these 11 categories. British Columbia Vital Statistics from 1897, and I will talk about that further in this talk. Grave markers, business partnership records, because the Chinese Immigration Act placed such an emphasis on merchants being able to bring family or crisscross the border or basically just live and work, that business partnership records for Chinese persons is actually a huge genealogical resource in my area. Immigration records, Jiapus and Zupus are Chinese family trees. Name associations, such as the Wang Association, the Li Association, they still exist, the ones that haven't burned down in various fires. But the thing is, if you're going to use them, you can't just call up and say, hey, am I looking for a record for, my person, because they most likely don't know. You have to go, you have to bring a translator, and you have to do the on-site work yourself. But these record sets exist. Not everything is online. Naturalization, because no Chinese person was considered a naturalized citizen by birth. Those were only British people. Therefore, naturalization records exist for Chinese. And, not just for Chinese, for Polish, for all Germans, all kinds of other categories where the government excluded them for various reasons. Oral history, order and council lists, because after exclusion was repealed, then people wishing to reunite their families had to apply to the government, and then the government approved these applications through orders in council. Therefore, orders in council lists are important for Chinese genealogy. Passenger lists, taxes in city, because after all this, taxes, always taxes. You can't escape taxes. Church records. Okay, so church records are a huge category for genealogy. And when I was doing my study, I found there appeared to be very few church historical records for Canadians, Chinese. If there are any, they appear to be only Methodist or Presbyterian. There were very few Chinese churches, and that's a whole nother topic. And therefore, any Chinese person who received ministry had it by traveling ministers. So, for example, from my study, I had to prove the 1889 marriage of one Alexander Gumiao and his wife Eva Chan. So I went to the BC archives, and fantastic, I got this index. Of course, it wasn't digitized, but frankly, very few Chinese Canadian records are, and so I acquired the record from the archives. It looks like this. For those of you that have seen a marriage record before, they are filled with fantastic information at the time of the event. So direct, primary. But the thing that I would like to point out to you is this, that both bride and groom were Methodist, and they were married by Ebenezer Robson by license. Okay, so who is Minister Robson? I went on a journey because I wanted to find the corroborating church register to match the civil record. When you are trying to prove a marriage, you want as many sources at the time of the event as possible, and so you can't overlook church records. And that took me on a 2-year journey to learn all about the United Church of Canada, how its history included the amalgamation of the Congregational Union, the Methodist and the Presbyterian churches, and how the archives hold a number of deeply important Chinese Canadian records. But it appeared Ebenezer Robson's traveling ministers' registers are lost to history. I mean, maybe they're in an attic somewhere, but what a loss, because he ministered to Chinese. Very few others did. All of his registers, therefore, it makes a big impact when you are researching an underrepresented population. Okay, so why? Why so few church records? Like previously, I just talked about what the church records were, but why? And I don't know. But here's my theory. I believe that historically there were opposing forces, that churches wished to proselytize, to widen and deepen their body of Christian Chinese, and in opposition, labor forces wanted to protect jobs and were anti-competitive. And to support that, I will show you this. In 1901, there are many articles, but this one was particularly virulent, and it says, now it appears to me that the working men should take a little trouble to find out the churches who aid the Chinese to learn English, and forthwith make it a matter of honor to see that no money is subscribed by working men to this church. So there you go. That could be one reason why so few church records exist. So what creates a record? Previously, I talked about church, government, and people. So here, government, the legal and regulatory framework. Some important laws for Chinese Canadian genealogy are the Chinese Immigration Act of Canada, the Exclusion Act of the United States, the Dominion Elections Act, the Citizenship Act, and I picked 3 more laws from around the country from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. So Saskatchewan, the court held that the term Chinaman did not refer only to people from China, but all Chinese, thus persons born in Canada and all naturalized citizens. So if you were Chinese, you could not employ a white woman in Saskatchewan. In Manitoba, it made it extremely difficult for Chinese to operate laundries. In Ontario, this benign-sounding act said no Chinese person shall employ any female white person in any factory, restaurant, or laundry. And since Chinese persons pretty much only had factories, restaurants, and laundries, that's a total ban on any Chinese person being able to employ a white woman. So, in essence, Immigration Acts and the Citizenship Act are about population control, about Canada designing what it wants the fabric of the population to look like. The Dominion Elections Act is about civil rights. And these three at the bottom are about business, competition, and ethics. I will speak more about the Immigration Acts. All right, so those are the laws, but like, we're about genealogy. So how does it affect records for genealogy? In 1881, British Columbia held 99% of the Chinese in Canada. Thus, this province is overweighted in its importance for Chinese Canadian genealogy. 10 years later, that statistic had dropped to only 87%. So still, the vast majority of Chinese persons in Canada prior to 1891 were in BC. Therefore, BC, really important. And the BC Vital Statistics Act said, well, that Chinese and Aboriginals were excluded. And under Chinese, they meant Asians. And so it was 25 years before it was amended to include Chinese and Japanese, and then Aboriginals. I'm not able to discuss, unfortunately, the ins and outs of how BC treated Indigenous vital statistic records, but just quickly, it said, yes, we're going to include Aboriginals. No, we're not. Yes, we are. No, we're not. Yes, we are. And so Aboriginal vital statistics were only officially included in 1916. So, for underrepresented populations, you may not be able to see birth, marriage, and death records, because if there are no church records and there are no civil records, if they were born, married, or died in the 25 years between 1872 and 1897, there's probably not going to be a lot of original records to see. That leaves the Chinese Exclusion Act, which the official name is the Chinese Immigration Act, 1885 to 1947. All right, so why is it so important for Chinese genealogy? First of all, people do call it the head tax. And in my mind, that kind of minimizes the impact of this particular package of laws throughout its history. There's another story that I often heard when I was researching. It was that the Exclusion Act was repealed in 1947, and then we got the vote. Actually, that conflates two different things. I understand that they were very tightly wound in terms of their importance with each other, but actually, the Immigration Act was not about voting. It was the Dominion Elections Act. It is believed to be only about immigration, in other words, people coming into the country. And what's so bad about that? Keep the borders closed, keep Canada the way that we want it to be. But in fact, it was a multi-million-dollar bureaucracy with, I counted 6 offices in Canada and 1 in Hong Kong. In my mind, the Chinese Immigration Act is really the Chinese Act. Its more direct parallel in Canada is the Indian Act. It's the Chinese Act for Chinese people. The Chinese Immigration Act tracked every Chinese in the country for decades. And for a genealogist, there are 58 types of certificates. There are multiple different registers for each of these types of certificates. Oh, okay, are you ready for the alphabet soup? CI5, CI30, CI28, CI9s. Those are just like the most popular ones. CI44, CI45s. And it contains, well, rather than talk about it, let me show you 3 or 4 examples of what it contains. So this is the General Register of Chinese Immigration. This is kind of like a census and a passenger list, kind of like all mashed together. Except the General Register of Chinese Immigration was held in Ottawa, and it is the central registry. It contained these 20 different categories, and it tracked Chinese persons over time. I have found in my research that it was frequently updated. If a head tax number was changed, if it was lost, if it was replaced, as they were, then that notation was made. That's basically column 4, all of these little notations. Oh, sorry, right here. So imagine if you're a genealogist and you want a rich set of records and you're looking for when they originally entered the country, the General Register of Chinese Immigration. This is also one of the foundational record sets at Library and Archives Canada. All right, so this is another quote, head tax certificate. Now, this is not in any archive. In fact, most of these certificates have been lost to history. We are literally crowdsourcing a collection of these original certificates for study with the Paper Trail exhibition, which will be opening the new Chinese Canadian Museum on the 1st of July, 2023. So this particular certificate is really interesting because it's my great-grandfather. Okay, it's not interesting because of that. It's interesting because he arrived in 1884. Why is that interesting? Because it predates the Immigration Act by a year. In other words, he was already in the country, but the government swept him up, and because they didn't have a certificate for his particular situation, they just took one and they crossed a bunch of stuff out, and that became his certificate. This is a CI-9. Now, a CI-9 is a Chinese-only re-entry permit, and what it did was, if any Chinese person wanted to leave Canada and come back, they had to first apply for permission and pay a fee every time they left the country. This is the second set of foundational documents that is currently at Library and Archives Canada. Now, this is my family member. He was born in Vancouver in 1906. These records are incredibly detailed, and as a genealogist, I have used them as proxies in the absence of vital statistics. In some ways, they are more detailed. They have birth information, they have original date of entry, if not born in Canada, its photo, signatures, in the case, the Chinese name, and because it was a re-entry certificate, there is a date for exit and there's a date for re-entry. In this case, Queenie left the country on the 17th of February, 1937, and he went to the United States for like the weekend, and then he came back 4 days later on the 21st of February. So it is possible for a person to have multiple CI-9s, as well as a CI-5 and a CI-28, multiple certificates tracking different phases of a person's life, work, business, so on and so forth. Okay, so at the top of this talk, I told you about this document. And you see, it has taken me almost 3 decades to understand the Chinese Immigration Act and its impact on the community and what it actually meant. What it actually meant is this. This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. What it's saying is the carrier of this certificate is not a legal person in Canada. My father carried this pretty much his entire life. I'm actually very fortunate that he didn't destroy it. Birthright, what does that mean? Nothing. Okay, so in addition to the Exclusion Act, in BC, so British Columbia has rendered an apology, done an awful lot of work in reimagining the BC archives, the BC Museum, and has funded to a great degree the new Chinese Canadian Museum. In its review of its legal history, it found over 200 anti-Chinese laws, which were either explicitly or implicitly anti-Chinese. I won't read them all, but I put them in broad categories. These are all about voting. In other words, if you were not on the voters list, you couldn't, act as a juror, work for the electric light company, you couldn't vote for mayor, you couldn't vote for alderman, you couldn't run for the legislature, you couldn't serve or vote for a trustee. In other words, you had no voice in the say of education. You couldn't be a pharmacist, you couldn't study law, you couldn't be a notary public, you could not work in the legal professions, you couldn't even log land in BC. So it's not just about voting, you see, it's about civil rights. Because so many laws hinged on the ability to vote, ipso facto, when voting was returned to Chinese in 1948 at the federal and provincial levels, all of these other rights clicked into place. Okay, so there were many laws anti-Chinese about crown land and timber. What that means for genealogists is there probably aren't going to be a lot of like original land records for a Chinese person. Not to say there aren't any, just not a lot. This package of laws meant that Chinese persons were not able to, work in a coal mine, work at the waterworks, work at the telephone company because they had to take a test. Only Asians were given this test, and they usually failed. Another story is that Chinese persons in Canada worked on the railway after it was built. And you know what? Maybe that's true. I don't think so. Because this dozen set of laws, and there's more, specifically exclude Chinese from working on any railway or in the mines. So for Chinese who did work in the mines, I'm really curious how that company got Chinese workers, because holy cow. To summarize, there were 39 laws about voting, 89 laws about employment and rights, and 39 more laws about everything else. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that if you were Chinese and you were living in Canada during the time that these laws were in place, you are much more likely to hit the court system, the police records. And that's where criminal records become more important than church records. See, it's a different way of looking at things. You go where the documents point you. All right, so another thing about impossible genealogy is, what if excellent records existed in a different jurisdiction? Like, what if, for example, the States? Okay, so why? Why look at the Exclusion Act in the United States? First of all, it was a package of laws for Chinese, 1882 to 1943. Okay, check, that seems familiar. Chinese in the US were treated as aliens and monitored with a particular emphasis on catching immigration fraud. Oh, well, that sounds familiar, check. To understand the Exclusion Act laws, it's important to see that Canada and the United States heavily collaborated between 1882 and 1943. In other words, all of North America between 1882 and 1949 and beyond. Just because the large laws may be repealed, it takes years and years for them to grind down. So it was repealed in 1947, but there are still 20 more years of the effects of these laws being in place. So an Exclusion Act case file, because American privacy laws are very different than Canada's, are amazing. And because we know that Chinese Exclusion Act case files were created for any Chinese person in the country, that includes Canadian Chinese, it is possible, in fact, I am doing it, to trace Canadian Chinese in the States. I have 36 case files. Now, what's in a case file? Everything. For a genealogist, it is a bonanza. There are copies of your existing Chinese immigration certificates. I think I have shown that a single Chinese person would have multiple certificates throughout their life. Letters from the applicant, from their witnesses, from the immigration officials on both sides of the border, talking back and forth about this particular immigrant. Q&As, including how much money do you make and how do you prove that? bonds that some Chinese persons had to put up and the companies that had to put up the bond, business partnership records, which I have mentioned earlier. The gold mine are like these little index cards of reference sheets, which not only show you that this person had a case file, but that their entire family might have one too, because they were really into catching immigration fraud. So they wanted to find what family members were related. So these little index cards pointing to other case files. Yeah, you find one case file, you go to the index card, and then you just start requesting all the rest. It is amazing. Biographical details, photos, and a deep history of the applicant over years. So minor case files for things like a weekend in Seattle, or you're in Ontario, a weekend in New York or Boston, and for as long as the person was, what's the word? I don't know. Surveilled is the word that comes to my mind. So, in fact, I've been doing a lot of research into tracing record sources outside of Canada for Canadian genealogy, and I have found that, generally speaking, there are 4 main NARA, National Archives and Records Administration offices in the United States that are important for Canadian Chinese genealogy. They are in Seattle, Washington, Denver, Colorado, in Boston, and in New York. Now, roughly speaking, Eastern Canadian Chinese who cross the border, their files will be over here in Boston and New York. Western Canada will, roughly speaking, be here in Seattle, and then there are subsequent case files in Denver. Researching these case files taught me something else, unexpected. Surprise, Ottawa. Canada also had case files. Not only did Canada have case files, but it had case files for like almost 100 years, 1900 to 1993. Very few people can access them, just approved researchers and close relatives. These things are locked tight as a drum. So, as a researcher, I'm constantly throwing out methods and processes and analysis on my blog. And in 2020, I wrote the finding aids at LAC, where we were, where you could find them, how you would use them. They're really hard to read through. And this year, one of my readers took my methods and ran with them. And not only was he successful, okay, it was a long fight, but he was successful. And he shared with me his grandfather's case file. It is like Christmas, people. There are tens of thousands of these things. Tens of thousands. All right, so let me skip from records into tools. Language. Language has been a big barrier for genealogy. And let me just tell you, I love AI when it comes to this. Artificial intelligence. It is driving so much knowledge and comprehension of previously inaccessible records due to language. I personally use all of these. Pleco, language packs on my PC, language packs on my Macintosh, Google Translate, but only from Chinese to English. It doesn't work very well the other way, especially with names. The Google Chrome browser feature with the automatic translation plugin, game changer, holy cow. When I am researching the Shanghai library, which you can do, it's entirely in Chinese, except Google Chrome, bada bing, bada boom. It's amazing. Google Chrome is available for many other languages other than Chinese. Check it out. And then, because it's like a 6-step process for me to translate Chinese, and I'm still not confident that my translation is any good, I have trusted experts. I said at the top of this talk, assemble your list of trusted experts. Now, when you're doing Chinese and other Asian languages, the culture of naming is something that you really have to get behind. And I kind of feel like with Chinese genealogy, it's like we're 10 steps behind the ball. Because, holy cow, as Liping Wang Yip showed, it's impossible to find the right name. And so how do you find the name? The best sources are Chinese grave markers in Chinese, any family elder in the community who might know your family, family name associations, the Wongs, the Lees, and as I said, you can't just call them up and say, hey, I'm looking for this record. You have to go and have patience, because the immigration records could have the names. Certainly, American case files that do have alias names. You have to write a list, just start writing them out. And historical books. Let's not forget the research done by people such as Dr. Stanley, Dr. Yu, Dr. Whitberg, and so many. In terms of sources, you know, a person once wrote to me and said, well, I found a marriage record and I think it's wrong. Like, how is it possible that an original record could be wrong? And I thought, oh yeah, right, that's right. That's true. So in genealogy, we learn to weigh the evidence in record sources. When you can't find documents, you have to start somewhere. Maybe your start somewhere is down here, number 15 or 16. You start there, you start somewhere. And then after that, go back up the list. You start looking for photos, newspaper articles, city directories. They won't list your Chinese person by name probably, but if they had a business, they should be in the Chinese only business section. And so on and so forth, until you can flesh out the records that you're looking for, the ones that were created at the time of the event by reliable people. Ask the family. This is a sketch that I did when my grandmother was talking about my grandfather's cousins. Sometimes your family is your most important source. Build on that. I have literally done cases that look like this. Can't find any of this other stuff, but I have great immigration records and I was able to trace them for decades through taxes. When there are such sparse records, the keys to combating scarcity and researcher bias are process, analysis, and writing. You must weigh the evidence constantly with every new fact, determine where that fits in all the records that you have, and keep building, keep going, keep going. Evaluate, reevaluate, reevaluate. As you know, the joke is, my genealogy is done, said no genealogist ever. So I completed my study before I kept Gen. The Lee Kumiao Wan family of British Columbia, 1823 to 2018. I believe this is the first study of its kind done for at the international level in Canada. My region was Western Canada. I spent about 1,600 hours. It felt a lot like a PhD. It contains a 40-page report, 39 supporting records, a pedigree chart, family group sheets, all supported with documents, birth, marriage, and death for every single person in 4 generations, and then a research log of over 100 pages. I spent about $3,500 for records and also for a Chinese language specialist to do the research I couldn't do, just to make sure that I wasn't missing something important because I can't read the language. I shared this study with institutions across Canada, the United Church of Canada Archives, the Vancouver Archives, the BC Archives, and other researchers who are looking into any member of the Alexander Wan Gumiao family. Alexander is popularly believed to be the first documented Chinese family of Canada. And in April, I received the wonderful news that I was passed, and I can now go on to the levels 2 and 3 of testing. So, what I'm trying to say here is a challenging genealogy tests all of your precepts, all of your assumptions. If you have a record gap, ask why. Dig into it. If you find a strange record, pause. Don't just file it and go on. I could have done that with my dad's record, and then I wouldn't have this deeper understanding of the landscape of history for Chinese in Canada. Records are being digitized every day. Family Search is doing an amazing job of going around the world and digitizing records. We are crowdsourcing records for Chinese genealogy. I encourage anyone who is working in any other genealogy to go into great grandma's attic and just start scanning, because we need to backfill our history. And I would like to summarize this entire talk by saying, I think I have shown that Chinese Canadian genealogy is not only not impossible, it is actually provable to the genealogical proof standards. Thank you.